Hi everyone, Adarsh here. So this is a continuation video of series of Servlet API specification 3, where for in the first video we have seen how we can create a basic servlet by using annotation of which is given in the Servlet specification 3. Then we have seen how we can configure filters for the servlet by using annotations, and we can configure those filters for a particular servlet, and those annotations are provided in the servlet specification 3. And then we have seen the third video, we have seen how we can configure how multiple URL for a single servlet. So in this series this video we're gonna see how we can configure context listener and servlet context attribute listeners basically for a web application. So as we know that for every web application there is a context, web context will be created inside the container, and context will be one per application, and servlet config will be per servlet, but servlet context will be one context per web application, and servlet config will be one configuration object for particular servlet. So servlet context is something where we can have we can store some informations, and we can just retrieve across the servlets component. So when we add attribute to the context, and when we remove the attribute from the context, or when we replace the attributes from the context, there are certain events which are captured by these listeners like servlet context listener and servlet context attribute listener. So servlet, whenever the web application started, servlet will be context will be web application will be initialized, and servlet context will be initialized. So context initialization event will be fired, and that can be captured by servlet context listener. And when context web application will be closed, and then the servlet context destroy event will be triggered by the container, and that can be captured by the context listener. And when we add any attribute to the servlet context, then attribute added event will be triggered, which can be captured by the servlet context attribute listener. If we replace any attribute from the servlet context, then replaced event will be triggered, so that can also be captured by servlet context attribute listener. And if we replace any attribute from the servlet context, then replace event will be triggered by the underlying container, and that can be handled by the servlet context attribute listener. So how we can configure those listener, and how that complete demonstration, that complete thing I have captured in this sample code, where I'm gonna give you a quick walkthrough that how we can configure, how we can use those sort of things. So let's jump into the code and see. So it's a Maven application. So we have a POM file where we have a group ID, artifact ID, version, packaging as a WAR file, name of the application, URL, organization tag, license tag, developer tag. We have a bunch of repository configurations here. Then we have a properties where we have a name of the project, source code encoding, JDK version 1.8, SLF4J version, and servlet version 3.1.0 release. Then we have a dependencies here. First we have a servlet dependency where group ID is javax.servlet, and artifact ID is javax.servlet-API, and version is 3.1.0 release. And then we have a SLF4J dependency and SLF4J log4j 12 dependency. Then in the build tag we have a final war file name, which is equivalent to the name of the application. And then in the plugins we have a standard Maven compiler plugin, which is 3.3. And after that we have a embedded JT container. So for this application, what will happen, once we build the application, we can just run the application without deploying to any external container. So what it does, basically it will download the embedded web container, JT container, and deploy the WAR file into that. So it become very easy for us while developing any web application. And so it removed the overhead of deploying and deploying to external web applications and all. So just to ease that part, I basically use this embedded container for testing. and then we have a standard Maven war plugin which will help us to build the war file out of this web application, where we have specified that when web.xml is missing, it should not fail, because everything is configured here in the with the annotations. But with the annotation, so if we see here, we have three directory. One is Java resources and web app. So in the Java resources, we have log4j.xml, where we have a console appender configured here. Then in the web app, we have web.inf, and inside the web.inf we have web.xml. So in the web.xml, you can see we have only context parameter, where so context parameter is something which is configured for application, not for the servlet. So for servlet there is a servlet config, but this is a context parameter. So context parameter name is Adarsh, and email is adarsh.kumar@esparkinnovationlabs.com. so these are the context parameters. Because context parameter we cannot I was thinking sometimes back why we don't have annotation for that, but after that I realized that if there is an annotation, we need to configure that annotation on the servlet, and context parameter is something which is not associated to the servlet. So that's why for servlet config parameter we have annotation, but for context parameter we don't have annotation. So that's why we need to configure in web.xml. So you can see there is no servlet configuration other than there is no servlet configuration or no listener configuration here. So if we go into the Java, we have com.ESpark Adarsh and help.txt. So in the help.txt we have a certain Maven compiling and building command, as well as the running the JT container and the URL to access the application. And in the directory we have listener and servlet. So first we'll go to the servlet. So servlet is here my servlet, extend from HTTP servlet, where we have override the do get and do post method and calling do process method internally. So in the do process method, what we are doing, we are getting a servlet context object first, and from the context object we are getting the name and email which we have configured in the web.xml. So what we are doing with the again we are adding that those values in the servlet context. Again we are doing that, so which gonna trigger a attribute added event. Then same again what we are doing, same value we are just replacing it, so it gonna trigger the attribute replaced event. And after that we are just removing the attribute from the servlet context, so it gonna trigger the event of attribute removed. So all these three events are captured by servlet attribute listener, servlet context attribute listener. And after that what we are doing, we are just writing a response to the stream, and we'll get this response. So we have in the listener we have context listener, my context listener. So first we'll go to the servlet annotations also. So servlet annotation, in the my servlet we have configured a servlet with @web servlet, and the URL is /myservlet, logical name is myservlet, description about the servlet, display name, and load on startup is 1 for this. And if we see the listener, we my context listener implements servlet context listener, and we have override the context initialize and context destroyed method, where we are just logging information, and we have configured @web listener. So automatically web container will identify what type of listener it is. And then so whenever web application starts, or so context will be created, so that time context initialize gonna execute for that servlet context event will be captured here. And whenever application was undeployed, then context destroy gonna execute. Then we have a my servlet context attribute listener. So this listener is implementing servlet context attribute listener annotated with @web listener, and it has three methods: attribute added, attribute removed, and attribute replaced. So whenever we are adding new attribute to the context, servlet context, this gonna execute. Whenever we are removing any attribute, this gonna execute, and whenever we are replacing anything, then this gonna execute. So that's how the configurations is. So let's build the code and see. mvn clean package mvn jt :run. So if you see here, if you see the logs, I just want to show you certain things. So from here, build success, application started. So if you see, here my servlet context initialized, so that context is initialized, and before that if you see that attribute added. So why this attributed are added? Because we have mentioned in the web.xml, so these attributes are added to the web context of the application. That's why we got the two messages here. Then context is initialized, and after that container started. So if I just hit this URL, so I'm gonna get the response here, name and email, which we have configured in the context parameter. But if we see the log, we got a hell lot of logs. Like first is attribute added. So what we have done again, here if you see servlet context attribute added here, okay. So let me make you one thing clear. These are the context parameters, okay. These are the context parameters which we have configured, and those parameters we got it here. And the log which you have seen here, attribute added, it is because of whenever the context initialize, container will add some informations to the context also. So that time also this got executed. That's why we have configured a attribute context attribute listener. That's why this got executed and we got these messages. Then if you see that do get method got executed, this context attribute added here, then attribute replaced, attribute added, attribute replaced, and attribute removed, and then we got a response. So if I just shut down this container by pressing Ctrl C, so you can see that my context listener context destroyed also got executed. It means context is destroyed. So I'm gonna save this piece of code to my GitHub repository, which is Adarsh Kumar Singh, GitHub/java_JEE. So my earlier applications are already there, and you can pull it up and you can play around with this. So I'm gonna save this piece of code to the same place. I hope this will help you to understand the concept, how we can configure listeners, especially servlet context listener and servlet context attribute listener to the web application of Servlet3 specification. Please share your thoughts and comment, and do subscribe my channel. I'll come up with some other type of listener in my upcoming video. Till then, take care. Bye.